dry earth waits in joyous anticipation. For at the sight of gathering clouds, rain is sure to follow. But this rain came before the thick clouds, and when the clouds cleared, indeed, Sharpville's earth was wet, nay, soaked, and colored in crimson red, for it had rained not water from the skies, but biting steel bullets, shot from the white man's gun by O.V. Mordy.
Welcome to the JJC Junior Council Podcast Experience. My name is Gad.
My name's Miquela.
Hi, I'm Kwande.
We're going to be speaking about the history behind the Sharpville Massacre. As we're celebrating Human Rights Day, many don't know what actually happened on the 21st of March 1960. In 1959, the ANC planned a mass campaign to protest the pass laws. The PAC, which was a breakaway party of the ANC, decided to advance this protest to the 21st of March 1960. On the 21st of March, approximately 20,000 protesters gathered outside the Sharpville police station without their passbooks. The aim of this was to get arrested. The idea behind this was to overwhelm the prison system so that the police could not arrest all of them. So they had to bargain with the protesters to get rid of the pass laws. This got out of hand, which led to a police officer shooting at the crowd, which eventually led to all of the police officers shooting at the crowd, which resulted in 69 people dead and approximately 100 injured. They were all shot in the back, which shows that they were running away. This is a very sad topic to speak about because not all of us know what actually happened at Sharpville. None of us know why we celebrate Human Rights Day. And their actions and their sacrifice is why we're able to celebrate the freedom that we have today.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to acknowledge the place that the Sharpville Massacre has in South African history. I think it's very important to see that the massacre, and as well as many other events or things such as the Freedom Charter, etc., had such a big role to play on the freedom and democracy that we enjoy today. Specifically the Sharpville Massacre, I think it was the start of a change of tactics, essentially, for the ANC and the PAC, and it is recognized as a major turning point for the struggle because it's firstly put a lot of international pressure with things such as sanctions on the apartheid government. And I think a lot of the freedoms and the fact that we are able to be together like this as people of different races and of people of different ethnic groups are because of the sacrifices made on that day. Yeah.
I agree with Kwande, because I feel that the Sharpville Massacre was an event that reminded all of us on how precious it is to be a human, internationally and nationally. And not only was it a turning point in South African history, but it was also a turning point in the art of South Africa. The event created such a great uproar of creativity. So many playwrights started to write, such as Athol Fugard, Gibson Kante, and a very, very distinctive one is Blood Knot, which came the year after in the 1961. And a lot of people came and watched it, especially in Sophiatown. I'm not sure if you guys know the Johannesburg Market Theatre. It was showcased there and everything, and before people were segregated, obviously, in the apartheid regime, but this event, through art, brought people together. Like, we were having multiracial audiences, and that wasn't allowed, and obviously there were some issues back then with that, but they persevered because of this event. It gave them such courage. So I think that was an amazing happening in the art world.
Yeah, I agree. How do you think their actions affected modern art and drama?
Well, I think their actions allowed a lot of modern artists and a lot of dramatic artists to be more bold and to also not allow themselves to be kind of restricted in their expressions, because art and drama is about expressing yourself and what you think, and that event really showed them that, hey, there's different ways of saying what you want, especially in the art world. So that specific area in South African history brought a lot of changes because it was within the country. It wasn't something that had to come from outside the country. So I think that it was a good happening and it was meant to happen because it's impacted even myself to be bold in how I express myself.
And I think for me, I think it's very important that we recognize that the struggle was very multifaceted. So there was a lot of people who spoke about, who were on the ground fighting. There were people who were in the courts fighting. And there were like artists, like Miquela mentioned, people who use their art as a form of protest and a form of opposition to the apartheid government. So I think it's important that we recognize that as a society, I think we're all able to make change in the various things that we're good at. So I think that's very important to recognize.
Yeah, I agree. Because without their sacrifice, we wouldn't be able to enjoy the luxuries that we're experiencing now. By luxuries, I mean human rights. Because before the 21st century, what we're in now, the human rights were luxuries. Like not everyone had the privilege of being able to attend good schools, being able to sit in good restaurants, being able to be vocal about their opinions. But now in our society, we're able to do all of this due to the sacrifice of thousands and thousands of people that came before us.
I think the whole event promotes humanism, and also through these events, it really showed us it was a unifying moment, because not only was it the people who were affected, it was those who actually benefited from it, who fought it and said, no, I can't participate in this. So it was such a unifying moment that the rest of the world unified with us in that moment too. So I think it was quite liberating. So yeah.
No, I agree.
And I think with the modern day effect, a lot of the lessons learned from things like the Sharpville Massacre and other events in our history are incorporated into South African society today. And it's important that even though we are now in a democratic society and one where people are free and equal, I think it's important to acknowledge the influences that these events have had on things like our constitution, which is obviously recognized to be one of the leading constitutions in the world, and something that other countries also have taken from and learned from. So I think because of our very rich and obviously very sad and dark South African history, we now are able to be in the place we are today, and I think we should definitely appreciate those sacrifices.
So like the leaders of the struggle that we know now, like Stephen Biko, they wouldn't have. Do you think they would have still been around if it weren't for events such as the Sharpville Massacre?
I think the struggle in general, things influence each other. So I think the Sharpville Massacre and seeing that injustice and seeing the way that the apartheid government responded to a peaceful protest, I think it did influence people like Steve Biko. It did influence all these other struggle leaders that maybe we perhaps won't know as well as those, Biko, Mandela, Hani, all those people. But I think definitely events always have an impact on each other, and they always, are interlinked in some way. So I think, it did definitely have some influence.
Yeah. So the diverse culture that we have now with like South Africa is regarded as a rainbow nation because of how many different types of people that we have in our country, which is fantastic. Because looking back at our history, this wasn't allowed. We weren't allowed to be as diverse as we are now. And this has now made our country so beautiful. And we wouldn't have had this diversity if it wasn't for the efforts of the people that came before us. Because I don't think the drama, like you said before, would be so diverse and impactful if it wasn't for such events. Yeah.
To add on that, on the drama part and the unifying part is that it brought a lot of happiness between the people, even though what they were going through was really difficult. That still brought them some kind of happiness. So much music came out from that, lots of jazz music, a lot of Soweto jazz music came from that, and it was very even I listened to some of them because they're very nice. I don't know if any of you have seen the Zion play, but I recommend it. It's very beautiful. And stuff like that came out of something like this. And normally you would think to yourself, how can you see the bright side of this? But that's something that brought so much happiness, and that's why we can still remember it as something so impactful, because I think of the happy times, the way it brought people together and the playing the music and yeah.
I think, so Miquela, you did just speak about like the happy times, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that although there's very many dark things in South African history, people did resist this by, expressing their joy and expressing their happiness as communities. So I wanted to ask you guys, like, how important do you guys think it is to, in the face of struggles and oppression, to still have that, bright smile on your face in an act of defiance? How important do you guys think that is?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I think it's extremely important because it gets you somewhere and it shows that you've overcome it, that you've come out of it in a way if you choose the bright side of things. Because if you focus too much on the negative, it's going to end up engulfing you and it's just going to be really hard to escape. So I think looking at what our predecessors has done, it encourages me that there is a bright side to things and that if you look at the bright side, you can come out of it being a better person. And I've never met someone who regrets looking at the bright side in a difficult situation. So
I agree. That optimism is very important for us to still be driven, because if we let actions that hurt us affect us in such a way in which we are vengeful, in which we get lost in our actions, we're never going to be able to progress. That's why I think it's amazing how our predecessors actually were able to fight through their pain, because throughout this time there was amazing music. There was, if you look at their work, like the literature written, the music, it's amazing to see how happy people could be in such a horrible time, and that optimism is what allowed for us to be at today. If they weren't optimistic, I don't know what would have happened. Because the moment you lose optimism, you lose hope, and when you lose hope, it's very dangerous. Because what else do you have? What else do you have to hold on to and keep fighting for?
how do you think that message and that interpretation of the Sharpville Massacre is kind of showcased or brought out to the rest of the world? Because it did not only impact us. Lots of countries took this as an example to not do that because they realized that democracy.
I remember when I was reading over the Sharpville Massacre, the police did not want there to be like a procession of like 69 hearses, because they were scared of the image that would be released to the international community. So the bodies of the dead people were brought in trucks, coffins on trucks, and that image was still sent throughout the entire world. And this severely impacted what the world thought of South Africa during this time, because this actually highlighted what people saw in South Africa, because people didn't actually realize what was happening in South Africa until certain key moments, such as June 16th, the very recognizable photo that came from that. These events were what led to there being sanctions imposed on South Africa, which allowed for international help for the struggle. I think it did make a really, really important image.
And I think as humanity, I think it's important that, and I think we have the obligation to learn from injustice, and not only in our own countries. And I think now it's easier than ever because of things like social media. We can see things happening all around the world. So I think it's important to learn from this injustice wherever it happens, and then ensure that as humanity, it's never repeated. So I think Sharpville Massacre, Youth Day, or June 16 is an example of that, where as South Africa, we had this horrible thing, and then a lot of other countries in the world and a lot of other people in the world learned from this.
Yeah, because my culture is Congolese, my mom is Congolese, and I wouldn't be able to celebrate who I am, who my mom is, what she's instilled in me, if it wasn't for the freedom that we are able to enjoy now. I wouldn't be able to be vocal about my language, because I speak French. I wouldn't be able to speak about my language as freely as I would be able to, because we were discriminated against. Being people of color back in the day, we were discriminated against, and it would have been very hard for any of us to actually be vocal about our heritage and our culture and who we are. So I think it's amazing that we're able to share who we actually are now that we enjoy the freedoms that we do now.
And I can relate to that too, because I also come from the Congolese cultural heritage, cultural community, but I also have a Latino mom, so I see a lot of discrimination and a lot of unjust things that have happened to people on my both sides, because I come from a very people of color culture, so I can really relate to that when, like, especially when it's very nice when people who back in the day didn't even have it, like the want to know about your culture, now speaking to you in your language from your culture. It's like it's so touching, and they're doing it out of love and curiosity, and I think that's really touching because I want to share my culture, I want to share my heritage, and yeah, I agree with that a lot.
I think it's fascinating because, like, speaking about like us being like made of like so many different things.
Yeah.
My father is Israeli and my mom is Congolese. A white man and a black woman are able to now speak to each other and actually like integrate into community together. We take this for granted because we were born into this. It's been normal for us. But if you think about it, it's so weird to be able to think that before this wasn't allowed. Like, people of mixed races weren't allowed to integrate with each other, and now we're able to. It's a luxury that we take for granted because we've lived through this our entire lives, and I think it's amazing that we're able to enjoy such luxuries. As I've been saying, such luxuries due to the sacrifices that people have made.
And I think when we speak about the Rainbow Nation, I think it's important to first recognize that the Rainbow Nation doesn't only mean that people who are maybe indigenous to South Africa. I think it's also important, like God and Miquela said, that South Africa is kind of a melting pot for people from all around the world, you know. So, like God mentioned, his mother's Congolese, his dad is from Israel, and I think that really just shows the nature of how we are as South Africans and how we are able to, now that we've moved on from the injustices of the past, we're now able to, live together. And I think for me personally, I don't really have an experience with mixed race parents, for instance, but I think it's very interesting for me to see, like, even just as having two black parents, that there's a mix of cultures. So my mom, for instance, is Swati, but also has a Zulu background. My dad is Xhosa, but he also has a Zulu background. So for me now in my own household, it's a mix of that type of different cultures combining. So I think that's the beauty of a country like South Africa, and I think we really have to do a lot more to appreciate that.
Yeah. Speaking about appreciation, could you please just elaborate on the past laws and why they were actually hated by the people of South Africa in the 1960s?
I think the past laws, obviously now we can recognize it as a major injustice because it did violate the freedom of movement that we, linking back to Human Rights Day, that we freely enjoy and freely celebrate that freedom of movement, that we can go anywhere we want, and there's no, racial segregation on where we can go. So I think the past laws, why there was such an injustice, is because of simply that fundamental human right was taken away by the government, and people were rightly angry at that fact. So I think that's why there was such a big movement against the past laws, and that ultimately culminated in the Sharpville Massacre.
Yeah.
For this podcast, it was about Human Rights Day, and I actually have an activity for our viewers to do, and our listeners too. When you listen to this or when you hear this, I'd like you to go and to ask your parents or your grandparents about your culture, about your background. And then I want you to write 3 things that you're grateful for having that culture. Just to remind you that, like Gad earlier said, that it is a luxury and it is a privilege for us to be able to embrace our cultures and our race and our communities. Because back then people weren't allowed to do that and they were very severely punished for it. So I'd really appreciate it if you do that, and maybe in our next podcast you could tell us how that went for you guys.
Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next time.